The world was already burning when the sky split open, not in the natural way of suns dying or tectonic plates tearing themselves apart, but in the way of something profane, an annihilation that was less an ending than a desecration. The warp did not simply fall upon the planet. It consumed it in stages, peeling the atmosphere like skin, igniting oceans until their steam blackened the heavens, reducing mountains into shrines of molten glass. And in that choking twilight, the survivors crawled, gasping through the dust, their voices thin and ragged as they bore witness to what chaos truly means. It is not the swiftness of death, but the deliberate corruption of meaning itself. Nothing is permitted to end with dignity. Everything is dragged, screaming into parody. Among the ruins staggered Eldar, who once called this place sacred, for every world holds echoes of their lost empire. They were not soldiers that day, not aspect warriors in painted helms, nor seers shrouded in runes. They were simply kin artists, scholars, children too young to understand the weight of what had been taken. And yet, even amidst the screams and the flames, their grief crystallized into something harder than despair. It was not enough to survive, not enough to escape. Memory itself had to be guarded like a weapon. Every face lost, every temple shattered, every wraithbone construct defiled by the laughter of demons. These became promises etched into the soul. One survivor, her garments torn to ribbons by heat and ash, pressed a fragment of wraithbone to her chest as though it were still alive. She whispered names into it, the syllables burned and broken, but still defiant. Around her others did the same. Some spoke the names of lovers, others the names of ancestors or children. They knew the warp could never hear them in truth, that chaos feeds on such offerings. And yet they spoke, not to give their grief away, but to shape it into something chaos could not claim. Their voices wove together, hoarse and faltering, until the ruins themselves seemed to hum with the raw resonance of loss. Transformed into oath, the ground trembled as the remains of the Manufactura collapsed, their iron skeletons twisting under unseen hands. Demons lingered in the smoke, half-formed shadows gloating as they tore at statues and painted the air with shrieks. For the Eldar, it was not the sight of their foes that scarred deepest, but the realization that every desecration was intentional. Chaos never simply erases. It revels in unmaking. Statues of ancient heroes were twisted into mockeries. Sacred halls echoed with stolen laughter. Where once the sound of crystal harps drifted, now came only the metallic scraping of chains. Every act carried a message. What you love will not merely end it, will be profaned until even memory becomes pain. And yet, memory did not break. In the huddled caverns beneath the burning spires, survivors gathered, their skin blistered from the heat, their eyes stung with the chemical smoke of promethium fires, but their spines did not bend. Some wept silently. Others sharpened blades, already dulled from frantic battle. Every act was deliberate, ritualistic. They knew there was no victory here, no salvation, but there could be endurance. The first step in vengeance is survival. To breathe when the enemy demands silence is already defiance. A child, her hands blackened with soot, asked why the sky was bleeding. No one answered her directly. They could not give her the truth that the sky bled because their gods were dead and chaos danced upon the corpse. Instead, an elder placed a runestone in her palm, its surface glowing faintly with the last flickers of psychic power. "Hold this," he said, voice raw as gravel. "When you are older, you will remember. And when you remember, you will strike." It was a lie, dressed in promise, but it bound her small shaking hands to a future where vengeance was not abstract, above them. Firestorms devoured forests older than human civilization. Rivers boiled until their banks burst. Winged demons circled, shrieking hymns to powers that had no language but hunger. The warp storm was not content with victory, it sought permanence, to make the planet itself a monument to ruin. But in their hearts, The survivors built another monument, invisible yet indestructible, the refusal to let memory fade. For the Eldar, remembrance is more than nostalgia. It is weapon, shield, and prayer combined. In time, rescue came not from mercy, but from necessity. A Craftworld vessel pierced the storm's edge, its engines groaning with the strain of resisting the warp's pull. Shuttles descended, sleek as blades, gathering survivors in frantic silence. They looked upon the planet one final time, watching as its crust began to fracture, glowing lines splitting across its surface like veins of molten sorrow. The star above pulsed, an unnatural rhythm echoing with demonic laughter, and then the world cracked. Not simply destroyed, but sundered, becoming another scar in the galaxy's long history of wounds. A seer aboard the vessel, her runes scattered like broken glass across the floor, whispered that the world had not died. It had been stolen. Her words spread quickly, and whether truth or madness, they became belief. For the Eldar, belief itself is dangerous, shaping futures in ways even the most skilled farseer cannot predict. Yet in this case, it hardened resolve. If chaos could steal a world, then the Eldar would steal something in return. Not simply vengeance, justice, or perhaps something darker. A cycle that no god could break. The survivors did not speak of rebuilding. They did not speak of mourning in the human sense. Instead, they began to weave songs, not of beauty, but of blades. Melodies tuned to grief, harmonies sharpened into war. Instruments were rebuilt, not to please, but to resonate with psychic fire. Every note became a weapon, waiting for the moment to be unleashed. In those early days, vengeance was not a strategy, but an instinct, coiling itself around their veins, whispering that every drop of blood spilled would one day echo back at THOUSANDFOLD. Thus, the ashes of a dying star did not become silence. They became seed. The survivors carried their grief, not as burden, but as arsenal. The galaxy would not remember their world, for countless planets burn and are forgotten. But the Eldar would remember, and memory, sharper than any blade, would cut deeper than chaos could ever imagine. The void does not welcome the exiled, it swallows them. For the Eldar, who escaped the death of their world, the first days aboard the Craftworld vessel were not salvation, but an extension of ruin. They carried ash in their hair, smoke still in their lungs. The bitter temps of Prometheum fire lodged so deep, it seemed their very breath was made of ruin. The walls around them hummed with the steady pulse of wraithbone, alive with faint psychic resonance, but no song could mask the silence inside their hearts. They were a people between worlds, no longer belonging to the one they had lost, and not yet belonging to the future that demanded to be built. Each corridor of the Craftworld became both sanctuary and tomb. Survivors walked as shades, their footsteps echoing hollow against the polished bone beneath them. The scent of burned flesh clung to their robes, an odor no amount of cleansing oils could wash away. Every meal they consumed tasted of ash, not because the food was unworthy, but because grief poisoned the senses. To eat was to admit survival, and survival felt like betrayal when so many had fallen. Children cried in quiet, muffled sobs, as though instinct taught them the void itself listened. Elders whispered, stories, not to soothe, but to preserve. The name of every ruined shrine, every broken soapstone, every song that had ended mid-versal, were spoken aloud so memory would not collapse into dust. Despair lingered like a predator, circling unseen. Some among the survivors withdrew into themselves, sitting for hours before the glow of the infinity circuit, pressing their palms to the living wraithbone, begging for the voices of the departed to answer. Few ever did. Others drowned their grief in ritual, chanting the hymns of the Asuriani with raw voices, repeating words until their throats bled. It was not faith alone that kept them alive, but the stubborn refusal to allow chaos the last word. And yet, whispers grew, whispers of despair so heavy that even the long memory of the Eldar might break. It was during these nights of suffocating silence that the oath was forged, not in the council chambers of seers, nor in the barracks of warriors, but in the low, dim-lit spaces where refugees huddled together. A mother bent over her child, promising him he would see vengeance done. The youth who had lost both parents carved runes into his own skin, swearing their names would burn into him until chaos itself remembered. These were not grand proclamations. They were private acts of defiance, small embers smoldering in the vast cold of exile. But when joined together, they became a flame. One tale speaks of a gathering in the crystal gardens of the Craftworld. Survivors walked among shattered fragments of transplanted flora, leaves torn and brittle from the strain of warp-tainted storms. They gathered not to grieve, but to bind themselves. Voices rose, not in song, but in oaths. The words were simple: never forget, never forgive. The Craftworld itself seemed to tremble as the psychic weight of those vows imprinted upon the wraithbone. Whether myth or memory, it is said the Infinity Circuit carries those oaths still, humming faintly with every soul that joins it, a chorus of defiance echoing across generations. The wandering years began soon after. Driven from system to system, the Eldar learned what it meant to be unwanted. Human colonies, fearful of the alien, fired upon them without warning. Orc warbands hunted them across asteroid belts. Even among their own kind, the exiled were marked as cursed, carrying the scent of a world profaned. They drifted along the rim of existence, sustained only by what their craft world could provide, scavenging from derelict ships, stripping battlefields of weapons and armor. Every step of exile ground ash deeper into their lungs. Yet every star they passed, every cold world denied them, only carved their vow deeper. The ache of memory never softened. Survivors dreamed in fragments, streets filled with song, shrines filled with light, laughter that echoed through crystalline halls. And then the dreams always ended in fire. Waking became a torment, for reality was a repetition of loss. Some broke beneath the weight, seeking oblivion in the void, stepping from airlocks without hesitation. Others hardened, their grief calcifying into discipline. Rangers began to form among them, scouts who carried their mourning across the stars. Blades sharpened, not just for defense, but for the fulfillment of promises whispered in smoke. The seers warned them often. To let vengeance consume them would only open the same path that birthed the fall. But warnings could not still the fire, already burning in their hearts. They did not seek excess, nor indulgence, nor the dangerous joys that had destroyed their ancestors. They sought only the balancing of a scale that chaos had tipped with blood. To exist in exile was not merely to survive, it was to promise that every step taken in the void would lead back, inevitably, to the moment of retribution. There was a night when the stars outside the Craftworld flared crimson, a warp storm tearing open nearby. From its heart came echoes of laughter, the sound of demons still mocking the world they had stolen. The survivors gathered before the great viewport, eyes fixed on the storm. Some wept, others reached for weapons they could not yet wield against such a foe. And then, quietly, an oath was spoken, first by one voice, then another. It spread like fire across the chamber, uniting all who heard. The words were not recorded, for oaths lose power when set to stone. But those present claimed the Craftworld itself grew warmer, its wraithbone vibrating with a resonance that felt like heartbeat. From that night forward, the vow was no longer scattered fragments, but a single living oath, carried by every survivor. The wandering continued, years stretching into decades. The Eldar learned the rhythms of exile, the hunger of dust in their throats. The cold silence of void stretched infinite before them. They became skilled in hiding, striking vanishing shadows that moved where chaos spread. Each raid, each ambush, each whispered name, carved into the hilt of a blade, became part of the oath's fulfillment. Their grief did not lessen, but its shape changed. What had once threatened to drown them now hardened into a weapon as inevitable as the turning of the stars. And so the oath of exile became their core. It was whispered to children before they slept, carved into armor, painted upon the wings of fighters. They would not let suffering be meaningless. They would not allow their dead to vanish into silence. Chaos had taken their world, but it would not take their memory. And as long as memory endured, vengeance would follow. The Craftworld had wandered long enough through silence and exile that hunger gave way to necessity, and necessity turned to work. In the heart of its living structure, where wraithbone arteries glowed faintly like veins beneath skin, the forges awoke. They were not the crude manufactura of humanity, with smoke and slag and brute force. Eldar forges were places of harmony and resonance, where the strike of a hammer was as much ritual as it was function, where each blade was sung into being as though it were alive. Yet now, harmony had been replaced with grief, and grief had sharpened every tool, every hand, every sound into something different. The forges no longer echoed with art. They pulsed with sorrow, turned to steel. The smiths began their work, not with blueprints or orders, but with memory. Fragments of soulstones pressed to their brows, voices of the lost whispering in their thoughts, guiding their hands with sorrow's weight. Each weapon that took form carried the shadow of someone who could no longer raise one themselves. The edge of a glaive held the grief of a fallen kin. The curve of a shuriken launcher bore the memory of laughter silenced. In this way, their weapons were not merely tools of war. They were vessels, coffins of wraithbone and steel, that could strike in place of those whose voices had gone silent. The process was slow, deliberate, almost agonizing. Where once blades might have been wrought with elegance, their surfaces etched in sweeping artistry, now every line was heavy. Every rune carved deep, as though to cut into the material itself, the truth of loss. The resonance of the hammer's fall changed too. It no longer sang bright but rang hollow, like morning bells echoing in caverns. The artisans did not shy from this. They welcomed it, for each blow reminded them of what they had endured, and what they must one day repay. Young survivors were brought to watch, their eyes wide in the light of the molten crucibles. They were not taught through words alone, but through immersion in the sound and the rhythm. "See how the steel bends?" a smith whispered to a child clutching a shard of broken armor. "It bends, but it does not break. So must you." These lessons were not metaphors, but lived truth. The very act of forging became catechism, each strike an oath repeated, each finished blade a chapter in the living book of vengeance. There are stories told of a single weapon born in this era, a blade so heavy with grief that even its wielder could barely endure it. It was said to hum in its scabbard, low and mournful, as though the dead within it sang. When drawn, the song became a wail, strong enough to shatter glass and draw tears even from those who had no connection to its creation. Whether this was real or myth mattered little. The belief in such a weapon bound the survivors together, proof that sorrow was not only survivable, but transmutable into power. The aspect shrines grew swollen with initiates in these days. The path of the warrior became the chosen refuge for many, who could not bear the weight of grief without turning it into discipline. Dire avengers donned their helms, each rune painted with the name of the fallen. Howling banshees sharpened their blades until they could split a hair in silence. Their cries rehearsed not merely as weapon, but as echoes of screams they still heard in memory. Striking scorpions emerged from the shadows of the forges themselves, their mandiblades clicking in rhythm with the ring of hammer and anvil. It was said that sorrow itself was shaping the paths, warping them subtly into something fiercer, more relentless. The Craftworld seers worried, as they always did. They warned that too much grief etched into weapons could invite corruption, that the line between righteous vengeance and the path of she who thirsts was thin. Yet even they could not deny the necessity. The galaxy did not wait for healing. Chaos still roamed, still desecrated, still laughed in the dark. The Eldar could not stand idle. If sorrow was dangerous, then let it be dangerous in their hands, not theirs. And so the forges burned hotter, the wraithbones sang louder, and the oath of exile became tempered into steel. It was not only blades. Armor was shaped too, each plate painted with runes that held memory like a shield. Some bore fragments of destroyed worlds, fused into the metal as permanent scars. Others were designed to bleed light when struck, so that every wound shone with brilliance. A reminder to allies that they fought not only with the living, but with all who had been lost. Even the smallest tokens, shuriken discs, pistol grips, knife hilts were inscribed with names. No weapon was anonymous. Each was lineage, each a vessel of continuity. The forges became sacred in themselves, places where silence was not permitted, where each worker spoke the names of the lost aloud as they labored. To fall silent was to dishonor, to forget. The sound of grief, constant and unrelenting, filled those halls day and night until the craft world itself seemed to breathe with sorrow. Even those who did not labor there came to sit among the heat, pressing their palms to wraithbone walls, listening to the pulse of creation. They said it was like listening to the heartbeat of the dead. When at last the weapons were tested, they were not wielded against training drones or practice targets. Instead, seers guided the warriors into simulations drawn directly from memory. Demonic forms conjured from the warp were cast into the chambers, forcing the wielders to strike not in practice, but in ritual reenactment. Every thrust, every cut, every shot was a repetition of vengeance, unfinished. To master a weapon was not only to perfect technique, but to relive grief until it no longer paralyzed. Only when a warrior could strike without hesitation, without letting tears blur their vision, were they deemed ready to carry the weapon into the galaxy. Thus, the blades of sorrow were born. They were not tools made by artisans, nor instruments crafted by musicians. They were burdens, heavy with memory, sharpened with grief, quenched in the tears of survivors. And when the first warband of Eldar departed into the void, armed with these weapons, there was no song to mark their departure, only silence. The silence of a people who had transmuted their mourning into edge and point, who had decided that the galaxy itself would hear their grief, not in wails, but in the ringing of steel against flesh. And so the vow of exile hardened further. They would not forget. They would not forgive. And now, they would not wait. The Craftworld forges burned endlessly, echoing with the rhythm of sorrow. From them came not weapons of survival, but weapons of promise blades that carried within them the weight of an entire world, and the oath that chaos would bleed for it. In the beginning, their songs were laments, broken fragments of memory whispered into the dark. The Eldar have always carried music in their blood, for their very voices are instruments shaped by millennia of artistry. Yet, after the fall of their world, after the exile and the forging of sorrow into steel, song no longer belonged to beauty alone. It became a necessity, as vital as food or air. Where grief threatened to drown them, melody gave it form. Where silence threatened to erase the dead, harmony restored them. And slowly, across the craft world, mourning transformed into weapon. The first liturgies were sung before the Infinity Circuit, their voices trembling as they pressed soulstones against their brows. These were not the polished hymns of seer councils, nor the ritual chorales of aspect shrines. They were raw, cracked, hoarse with ash still clinging to the lungs. Yet something within the wraithbone stirred. The Infinity Circuit absorbed not only the voices, but the grief itself, amplifying it, resonating, until the very walls of the craft world seemed to hum with lament. Children stopped weeping to listen. Warriors laid aside their blades to kneel in silence. For in those moments, the living were no longer alone. The songs had summoned the presence of the dead. It was not conjuration, not resurrection. The Eldar knew better than to mistake shadows for truth. But as voices rose together, a psychic current swept through them, binding every singer into a single, trembling whole. Memories aligned. Faces appeared in the mind's eye, not only one's own lost kin, but the kin of others, shared like visions until grief became collective. They sang of those who had been burned, those who had been torn apart, those who had simply vanished into the warp. Each verse was a name, each name a blade of sound hurled against the silence. The resonance grew until even those without psychic gift felt it as pressure in their chests, a heartbeat too vast to be their own. Soon the seers began to take notice. At first, they approached with caution, fearing that such psychic resonance might draw predators from beyond. Chaos is always hungry for unguarded emotion, and grief is a feast beyond measure. But what they witnessed unsettled them. The resonance did not fracture into chaos. It focused. Instead of opening rifts, it sealed them. Instead of inviting intrusion, it repelled it. Where once the raw ache of mourning might have made them vulnerable, united song made them stronger. It was as though grief, when shaped by melody, became armor. Some whispered that even the great enemy hesitated before such harmony. Rumors spread quickly. One tale told of a seer who guided a chorus during a raid against Chaos Raiders. As the Eldar warriors advanced, their voices rose in chant, every remembered death woven into verse. Demons howled, striking at them with claws and flame, yet their blows seemed to falter, their shrieks cracking in the face of that unrelenting sound. Witnesses claimed the very air rippled, as though reality itself bent away from the song. Whether truth or embellishment, the survivors swore that the enemy retreated not from blades, but from voices. The rumor grew until it was said, in hushed tones, that the warp itself trembled before the chorus of the lost. What began as spontaneous ritual became structured liturgy. Spirit seers wove runes into the air as choirs sang, shaping resonance into patterns of protection. Warlocks learned to align their psychic focus to harmonies, strengthening their powers when voices surrounded them. Even exarchs adapted, training their aspect warriors to chant as they marched, so that every step carried the weight of both discipline and grief. No longer were songs confined to shrines or gatherings. They became battlefield tools, woven into strategy as much as blade or armor. Yet, for all their strength, the songs were not without cost. To sing of the dead is to reopen wounds, and some who gave themselves too deeply to the chorus never returned. They collapsed in silence, their voices spent, their souls flickering like candles guttering in wind. The infinity circuit absorbed them gently, but their kin wept to know that song had claimed them as surely as any blade. Still, none questioned the sacrifice. Better to die in song than to live in silence, for silence was the weapon of chaos. The Harlequins were the first outsiders to acknowledge the transformation. They arrived unbidden, as they always do, their masks painted with the faces of both laughter and grief. They danced through the forges and shrines, listening, watching, their steps echoing to rhythms only they could hear. And then they spoke. "You sing well. You sing not of art, but of war. Keep singing. The galaxy must hear you." And just as swiftly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving behind only the memory of masked faces nodding in approval. The Harlequins' words carried weight, for they are servants of the laughing god, and if even they bowed to grief's melody, then surely it meant something more than survival. From that time, the songs of the lost were no longer seen as private ritual, but as destiny. They were sung before battles, during the forging of blades, in the quiet hours of night. No voice was deemed too weak, no grief too small. Even those who had lost no one in the burning of the world sang, for in the collective, every sorrow was shared. The songs became tide and river, flowing through the Craftworld's infinity circuit, binding generations yet unborn to the promise that memory would not fade. And so the Eldar found a new weapon, not forged of steel, nor carved from wraithbone, but shaped from breath and memory. A weapon chaos could not corrupt, for it was not indulgence, not hunger, but defiance. Each chorus was a fortress, each verse a blade, each harmony a shield. They did not fight alone. They fought with the voices of the dead rising through them, strengthening their hands, steadying their aim. Thus, the oath of exile deepened once more. They would not only fight with steel, they would fight with grief itself, sung into the air until even the warp quaked to hear it. And somewhere, perhaps in truth, perhaps only in rumor, the powers of chaos began to whisper of the Eldar differently. No longer as prey, no longer as relics of a dying race, but as a chorus of memory that refused to break, whose song would outlast even the laughter of gods. They came without warning, as they always did. One moment the Craftworld lay in its rhythm of morning blades hammered into shape, songs rising to the infinity circuit, and in the next, shadows moved along the wind. No one could say when the Harlequins had arrived. There was no record of their docking, no sight of their ships. They were simply present, masks gleaming in the glow of Wraithbone halls, their movements impossibly fluid, their laughter sharp as the crack of breaking glass. The Harlequins never announce themselves. They do not need to. Their presence is omen enough. Whispers filled the corridors, messengers of Sigurach, the laughing god, the only one of the Eldar pantheon said to survive the fall. To see them is to be reminded that theater is not mere distraction, but blade, shield, and prophecy all at once. They danced through the forges where sorrow sang on anvils, their steps scattering sparks that seemed almost deliberate. Like stars arranged into hidden constellations, warriors watched with unease, for in the Harlequins' gestures were riddles, and in their riddles, always death. The performances began without invitation, in the central hall, before the crystal gardens, where survivors still gathered to whisper names. They danced the memory of ruin. Their movements replayed the annihilation of the world. Every pirouette a burning tower, every leap a scream swallowed by warp fire. To witness it was agony, for the Harlequins do not soften truth. They carve it open, forcing all to see. Eldar wept openly as the dancers reenacted the laughter of demons, the collapse of spires, the shattering of souls. Yet within the performance there was also something more, a subtle shifting of rhythm, gestures that pointed not only backward into memory, but forward, into futures yet to come. Prophecy is a dangerous thing among the Eldar. It is never certain, never fixed, only glimpsed through shards of what might be. And yet, the Harlequins wove it into their play, as if the threads of destiny were ribbons in their hands. A masked figure in white painted the symbol of chaos in the air, only for another, masked in crimson, to slice it apart with a blade. The Watchers understood. There would be vengeance, and it would come soon. Whether this was foresight or simple theater mattered little. For the Eldar to see prophecy performed is to make it real. The Harlequins spoke little, and when they did, their voices echoed as though they carried more than one speaker within. "You sing your grief," they said, gesturing to the morning choirs. "Good, but grief must dance as well. Grief must strike. Grief must bleed." Their words were riddles, impossible to pin down, yet none doubted their meaning. Where the Harlequins danced, death followed. Their performances were never entertainment. They were rehearsals for slaughter in the days that followed. The Harlequins whispered to seers, passing secrets that sounded like nonsense until laid upon the skeins of fate, a system where chaos warbands were gathering, a void root newly exposed by warp storms, a fortress world already half-damned, waiting for its end. None could say how they knew these things, only that they spoke with the certainty of those who walked paths beyond mortal eyes. Some believed they traveled not only through the Webway, but through time itself, skipping like stones across rivers of possibility. Others insisted they were no prophets, merely actors who knew how to make chance itself bow to their performance. Whichever the truth, their presence always meant action, and so vengeance found its stage. The Harlequins led war hosts into ambushes, their masked figures flickering at the edge of sight, laughing as chaos fell into traps woven like plays. They struck not with overwhelming force, but with precision, turning battles into theater. An enemy warlord brought low with a flourish of blades, his death echoing like the climax of a tragedy. A demon driven screaming back into the warp by warriors who moved in perfect rhythm, as though choreographed by unseen hands. To fight alongside Harlequins was to become part of their mask. One actor in a performance where death itself was the audience. Fear spread among their enemies. Chaos warbands spoke in hushed tones of Eldar, who did not fight like soldiers, but like ghosts. They claimed the very air shimmered before attacks, that laughter echoed in the dark before slaughter began. Some swore they saw masked faces even in their dreams, a chorus of painted visages dancing at the edge of their vision, waiting. To face the Harlequins was not only to face death, it was to face inevitability. Yet even among the Eldar, the Harlequins unsettled. Their allegiance was never clear. They served the Laughing God, but the Laughing God serves only himself. Were they allies, or merely performers, using grief as another stage? Their masks revealed nothing, their voices answered only in riddles, and still, none dared drive them away. For all their strangeness, the Harlequins carried something no other Eldar could offer, hope woven through inevitability. Their performances said one thing above all else, that chaos could bleed, and would bleed again. The oath of exile grew sharper under their influence. Where before the survivors had bound themselves in silence, in song, and in steel, now they bound themselves in performance. They learned that vengeance was not only a burden carried, but a play enacted. Every strike could be choreographed, every battle arranged as theater to humiliate the foe. Chaos reveled in desecration. The Eldar would answer with artistry that turned every act of vengeance into spectacle. In this way, grief did not merely resist, it mocked. Thus, shadows moved always on the wind, masks flickering at the edge of sight, voices laughing at the void. The Harlequins came and went without warning, their presence both a blessing and a chill, their performances always ending in blood. For the survivors of a dying star, they were a reminder and prophecy alike. Death would follow, but it would not be theirs. And as the Craftworld continued its wandering, the oath of vengeance found new form not only in blade and song, but in theater, in performance, in prophecy made flesh by those who danced upon the very edge of time. When the Harlequins chose to make war, it was never declared. No banners were raised, no proclamations carved into wraithbone. The battlefield was transformed into theater, and the enemy never understood until it was too late, that they had already been cast as characters in a play whose ending had been written long before they arrived. The Harlequins did not simply fight, they performed. Every strike, every leap, every mocking gesture of their masks was part of a greater mask, one that blurred the line between battle and prophecy, vengeance and art. The first clash came upon the fractured moons of a forgotten system. Chaos warbands had gathered there, their demons shrieking praises to their patrons as they prepared another raid upon the weakened galaxy. They had expected resistance, yes, but not theater. The Harlequin troops emerged like phantoms, masks gleaming under the shattered light, their arrival so sudden that even the demons hesitated. Then the performance began. Their blades sang first, kiss and caress, weapons so fine they seemed like ornaments until they pierced flesh with microscopic precision, turning bodies into sculptures of ruin. They danced among the foe as though weightless, vaulting across craters, pirouetting through fire, their laughter piercing the cacophony of war. To the mortals who fought alongside them, dire avengers, striking scorpions, rangers watching from the shadows, it was as though they were watching the dead return. The Harlequins moved with such eerie synchrony that one could not distinguish individual warriors. They were chorus and storm, the embodiment of memory striking chaos in every gesture. Survivors spoke afterward in whispers, saying they had not seen warriors at all, but the faces of their lost kin dancing through the smoke. The masks of the Harlequins reflected grief so perfectly that they seemed to take on the visages of the fallen. A brother lost to fire appeared in a blade dancer's leap. A mother slain in exile seemed to cry out through the voice of a Harlequin's shriek. Whether this was illusion, psychic trickery, or something far stranger, no one could say, but it left chaos reeling. How does one strike at an enemy who wears the face of those you thought dead? The masks of ruin were not random slaughter. They were plays with carefully chosen themes. One troop might enact the destruction of the Eldar's world, reenacting the fall only to reverse it, striking down demons where once temples had collapsed. Another mask might weave the story of vengeance yet to come, showing an enemy commander his own death before delivering it with theatrical flourish. These were not battles in the crude sense. They were performances so complete that the line between story and reality dissolved. By the time the curtain fell, there was only blood. Chaos warlords began to fear the sight of masks on the horizon. They claimed the air grew heavier before a mask, that laughter carried on winds no lungs had breathed. Some swore they could hear music-alien instruments ringing in tones that gnawed at sanity long before the first blade struck. And when the Harlequins descended, there was no rallying, no formation that could hold. Warbands scattered as though fate itself had turned against them. For the Eldar, who had once wept in silence, the masks of ruin became more than vengeance. They became affirmation. To fight alongside the Harlequins was to believe that memory itself had taken flesh, that the dead had not vanished, but returned to exact their due. Even hardened aspect warriors admitted they felt their blades steadied, their fear muted, as though the performance enfolded them as well. The Harlequins never explained, never acknowledged, but those who lived through such battles carried the certainty that they had been part of something larger than war. It is said that once, during the height of such a mask, a demon prince bellowed that he could not be slain, for prophecy had promised him victory. The Harlequin who faced him bowed with theatrical exaggeration, mask painted with grotesque laughter. Then, with a single motion, the Harlequin drew his blade across the prince's throat. As the beast's ichor spilled into the dust, the Harlequin whispered, "All prophecies are plays, and ours is the final act." Witnesses swore the demon's body dissolved not into the warp, but into applause that echoed until the battlefield was silent. The power of the masks was not in their weapons, though those were deadly beyond comprehension. It was in their ability to turn chaos's own methods against it. Where chaos desecrates, the Harlequins mock. Where chaos consumes meaning, the Harlequins impose narrative. Every battle became a story, and in that story, chaos always lost. For a people defined by their thirst for ruin, to be reduced to clumsy actors in another's script was agony beyond death, and the Eldar drank deep of that agony, knowing it was vengeance given form. But even in triumph, unease lingered. The Harlequins were not bound to craftworlds, nor to councils of seers. They answered only to their laughing god, and his humor is as cruel as it is cunning. Did they come to aid their kin, or merely because the mask required new actors? Were the survivors who swore they had seen the dead truly touched by souls returned, or were they deceived by masks and psychic echoes? The Harlequins never answered. Their silence was its own performance, its own riddle. Still, none could deny what followed in their wake. Where the Harlequins danced, chaos faltered. Where they performed, vengeance advanced. Survivors would carry the memory of their masks forever, describing them not as battles, but as visions. It was not war, one ranger said, it was theater. And theater does not end until the curtain falls. We only lived because the play was not yet done. Thus, the masks of ruin entered the oath of exile. To the blades forged in sorrow and the songs sung in grief was added another weapon, theater itself, sharpened into prophecy, delivered as death. The Harlequins would come and go as shadows on the wind, but when they descended, it was never merely to kill. It was to remind their kin and their enemies that grief could dance, memory could strike, and the stage of vengeance would never close. The galaxy remembers battles fought with banners high and drums beating, but the Eldar know such wars are waste. Their vengeance was not the clash of armies, but the silence between heartbeats, sharpened into a weapon. In exile, patience became their ally, and patience turned to strategy, and strategy became ambush. To fight chaos on equal ground was to court annihilation, for no mortal blade can match the endless tide of the warp. But to strike unseen, to strike when unseen, was to turn inevitability into advantage. The Eldar made of this truth an art. It began with the Rangers, the solitary hunters who had long walked paths beyond the craft worlds. They returned now, not as wanderers, but as executioners, carrying grief as quivers of endless arrows. They ghosted through forests where chaos desecrated shrines, crept through void wrecks, drifting silent in the dark, stalked demons across ruined plains. Their rifles whispered in the dark, and with every shot, a warband fractured. They did not kill for numbers. They killed for precision. A leader's head struck from his shoulders. A sorcerer's throat pierced mid. The strike of a ranger was not the thunderclap of victory, but the pluck of a delicate, exact, reshaping the harmony of battle until all other notes faltered. From them, the lesson spread. Corsair fleets learned to vanish into nebulas, waiting for days, weeks, until chaos ships grew careless. Then, like blades sliding from scabbards, the Eldar struck. Boarding parties fell upon their prey, not as raiders, but as shadows in a play. Every strike choreographed, every scream cut short before it could echo. When the battle was done, no witnesses remained. Only shattered hulks, drifting in silence, their crews scattered like puzzle pieces across void black. For the Eldar, an ambush was not complete until no story survived except the one they had written. The Craftworld seers refined this further. They wove strands of fate into patience itself, guiding warriors to wait in silence where the skeins promised victory. Whole war hosts would lie hidden within Webway passages, unmoving for days, their thoughts hushed, their blades unsheathed but still. When the seer's rune finally glowed, the passage would open, and the war host would pour forth like a tide of inevitability. To their enemies, it seemed not ambush, but prophecy fulfilled, for how else could an entire army appear in the perfect place, at the perfect moment, unless the universe itself had conspired against them? Chaos warbands began to whisper of cursed places, regions of space where to set foot was to vanish. They spoke of asteroid fields that swallowed fleets whole, never returning a signal. Of ruins where footsteps echoed, though no enemy was seen, until blood filled the stones. Some claimed the Eldar themselves had become ghosts, no longer flesh, but phantoms. Others insisted it was trickery. Illusions woven through the warp, yet the bodies told another story, shattered, scattered, arranged as if by deliberate hand. An Eldar ambush was not only a strike, it was a message, carved into corpses, that said, "We waited, we remembered, and now you are gone." For the Eldar, patience was not emptiness. It was a ritual. Warriors in ambush did not sit idle. They whispered names to themselves, repeated oaths beneath their breath. Sharpened blades not for need, but to fill the silence with purpose. Some claimed that during these long stillnesses, the dead whispered back, that when one waits in silence long enough, memory itself becomes companion. True or not, it made their patience unbreakable, where others might have faltered, grown restless, revealed themselves too soon. The Eldar endured, because waiting itself was vengeance. There is a tale of a chaos champion who mocked the Eldar, declaring that cowards hid in shadows, while true warriors fought in the open. He marched his warband through a desolate canyon, banners high, daring them to strike. The Eldar did not move. They let him boast, let his soldiers grow careless. Days passed. Supplies dwindled. His warriors grew restless, murmuring of unseen eyes, of laughter carried on the wind. When finally the ambush fell, it was not with arrows or blades. It was with silence so deep that every heartbeat felt stolen. His men broke before a single Eldar moved, scattering into the dark. Only then did the Rangers emerge, each shot deliberate, each corpse falling as if into a story long prepared. None survived to tell it. Even the Harlequins, masters of performance, acknowledged the artistry of these ambushes. "You write plays of patience," one masked figure said, after witnessing a ranger company dismantle a warband without a word. "But your plays have no audience, only corpses. That is good. The dead never forget." And with a mocking bow, the Harlequin vanished again into shadow. The Eldar took the words as affirmation. Their ambushes were not spectacles for others to admire. They were private performances, staged only for memory. And memory was the only audience that mattered. The oath of exile sharpened here as well. To wait was not weakness. To wait was power. Every ambush fulfilled was a reminder that grief had not made them reckless, had not driven them into blind fury, but had honed them into knives so patient they cut before the foe even knew a blade was drawn. Whole warbands vanished into silence, their remains scattered not in chaos but in deliberate arrangement, as though the battlefield itself had been reshaped into a forgotten puzzle whose final image was always the same: absence. And so the art of the ambush became another pillar of vengeance, alongside blades forged in sorrow, songs sung in grief, and masks danced in ruin. The silence of waiting turned patience itself into weapon. To the galaxy it was terror. To the Eldar it was justice, for they knew the truth. Vengeance is not in the strike alone, it is in the stillness before, the certainty that the enemy has already been caught in the web long before the first blow falls. The Exodite poets once wrote that the immaterium is not a place, but a dream stretched endless, and that those who walk it are not travelers but dreamers unwilling to wake. For the seers of the Craftworld, this truth became burden and weapon both. Grief had sharpened their sight, sorrow deepened their focus, until visions came not only in trance but in sleep, threading through the silence of exile like whispers of inevitability. They did not dream as mortals dream. They dreamed in war. Each night their minds wandered into the immaterium, where thought became landscape and memory became storm. They saw the dead walking among rivers of fire, calling names that had already been carved into song. They saw blades gleaming, not in hands, but suspended in void, as if waiting for a wielder, yet unborn. They saw chaos laughing in the forms of beasts, only for the laughter to curdle when shadowed figures struck from angles no logic could predict. These were not fancies, nor hallucinations. They were paths, futures woven in threads of dream, shimmering fragile until a seer's hand plucked them taut and made them real. At first, the seers resisted. To lean too deeply upon visions is to risk drowning, for the immaterium devours those who mistake possibility for certainty. Yet again and again, their dreams aligned with waking battle. A seer whispered of a ship's course changing by a single degree, and when the corsairs adjusted, they found a chaos fleet drifting unguarded. Another dreamt of a canyon where dust rose in spirals, and when rangers lay in wait at that spot, they struck down an entire warband before its sorcerer could summon aid. Coincidence faded into pattern, pattern hardened into weapon. Soon, the warriors trusted dream as they trusted steel. They followed visions into the void, their footsteps guided not by map or calculation, but by the muttered fragments of a seer's sleep. Entire campaigns were orchestrated on the rhythm of these whispers. To their enemies, it seemed uncanny, as if the Eldar knew not only where they would strike, but when they would falter, when they would blink, when their very doubts would betray them. Battles became theater of inevitability. By the time chaos realized they had walked into traps, The play was already closing its curtain, but whispers spread among the Eldar themselves. Were these dreams truly their own? Or were they voices of the dead, carried through the infinity circuit into the minds of the living? Some claimed they felt other hands upon their thoughts in sleep, guiding, urging, pulling. A warlock confessed that when he dreamt of a blade striking true, it was not his hand he saw, but the hand of his slain brother. Others spoke of faces rising unbidden from memory, dictating visions of strikes yet to come. The line between dream and inheritance blurred. Perhaps the vengeance of the Eldar was no longer theirs alone, but had been taken up by those already consumed, the lost pressing against the veil to guide the living. The seers did not deny it. They knew the infinity circuit was more than archive. It was chorus, collective soul, reservoir of all who had gone before. In grief, it had grown restless. The dead no longer lay in silence but murmured, shaping visions into clarity. The living might believe they dreamed, but perhaps it was the dead dreaming through them, using their minds as vessels to continue the war. The thought chilled some, comforted others, but none could deny the effectiveness. One tale tells of a great battle fought upon a ruined forge world, where chaos sorcerers had raised an army of iron-bound monstrosities. The Eldar had no reason to know its location, no scouts had marked it, and yet a seer woke in the night, gasping with the image of fire raining from the sky. Guided by this dream, the war host descended upon the world with impossible precision. Their weapons struck as though choreographed by unseen hands, each blow falling where armor was weakest, each defense raised before the enemy could strike. When the field cleared and the last demon's corpse lay smoldering, the seer whispered, "I saw none of this. It was their dream, not mine." She would speak no further, for her voice had turned hollow, as though she had left something of herself within the vision. The danger of this was not hidden. To dream too deeply was to lose oneself. Some seers never returned from trance, their bodies withering while their minds wandered paths no waking could follow. Their kin mourned them not with silence, but with uneasy gratitude, for even in death, their visions lingered, carried on by others as though threads had been passed from hand to hand. The cycle deepened, blurring the divide between who dreamt and who was dreamt through. Chaos began to whisper of it too. Sorcerers claimed the Eldar no longer fought with strategy, but with inevitability, as if their blades were guided by fate itself. Some whispered fearfully that the Eldar were no longer bound by mortality, that their dead fought through their living. Demons hissed in frustration when ambushes fell perfectly, snarling that they faced not mortals, but ghosts, wielding flesh-like armor. To fight the Eldar was to fight destiny itself, and destiny does not bleed. For the Eldar, the truth mattered less than the result. Whether their dreams were their own, or gifts of the lost, they wielded them. They turned each vision into arrow flight, each whisper into battle plan. The oath of exile became more than memory now. It became continuity. No death was final if the dead could still dream through the living. Vengeance had ceased to be the burden of the survivors alone. It had become the inheritance of every soul, bound within the infinity circuit, spilling through visions into the hands of warriors still breathing. Thus war in dreams became another weapon, intangible yet undeniable. Blades forged in sorrow struck true because dreams guided their aim. Songs of the lost found rhythm because visions whispered the right moment to rise. Masks of ruin unfolded flawlessly because the script had already been dreamt. The Eldar no longer fought as mortals guessing at outcomes. They fought as if every act had been rehearsed, every strike inevitable, and in the quiet between battles, when sleep came heavy, the seers would lie down knowing they might not wake as themselves. They closed their eyes, not with rest, but with anticipation, waiting for dreams that were no longer dreams, but corridors of vengeance, stretching endlessly through the immaterium. And when they woke, gasping, trembling, runes glowing faintly on their skin, they whispered only this: "It was not my vision. It was theirs." and they are not done. The Eldar have never buried their dead as mortals do. To consign a soul to rot in earth or vanish into flame is to allow it to slip toward the hungering jaws of she who thirsts. Instead, every soul is safeguarded within a spirit stone, bound into the infinity circuit of the craft world, preserved against the eternal hunger of the warp. Yet grief and exile reshaped this ancient rite, and what once was sanctuary became arsenal. Memory itself was no longer content to rest in silence. It demanded to walk, to strike, to kill. The first constructs were wrought in desperation. The living could not match the tide of chaos alone. Too many warriors had been lost. Too many seers burned their minds hollow in dreams. The craft world's seers turned to the infinity circuit, whispering oaths into its depths, asking not demanding, for the dead must always choose if the fallen would return. And they did. Their souls did not rest quietly. They burned with grief, as fierce as the living, and when offered a vessel, they answered. Wraithbone was shaped into towering shells, elegant and terrible, and into them the souls of the dead were bound. Thus walked the Wraithguard, the Wraithlords, echoes of once mortals, who strode now as giants. Each step of these constructs shook not only the ground, but the hearts of those who followed. To hear the heavy tread of a Wraithlord was to hear memory given form, a reminder that their dead did not forgive, did not forget. Warriors whispered that, when they fought alongside these giants, they felt their own grief steady, as though the presence of the dead made their sorrow less chaotic, more focused. The battlefield became an echo chamber where the rage of the living and the fury of the dead merged into one unbreakable chorus. Yet the binding was not simple. To anchor a soul was agony for both seer and spirit. Wraithbone thrummed like a living nerve, singing with resistance as the dead pressed into it. Some refused, their voices fading into silence rather than return. Others fought to be free of it, screaming through the constructs, vox grills with voices so raw they cracked stone. Only those whose grief outweighed their weariness consented fully, and even then, their presence was unsettling. They spoke rarely, their words thick with the echo of eternity, and when they did, it was always of vengeance. Guide me to them, one Wraithguard said, on its first waking, voice low as grinding stone. Guide me to those who laughed. On the battlefield, these constructs were terror incarnate. Bolts of shuriken fire ricocheted harmlessly off their frames. Blades that could sunder tanks glanced away from limbs of glowing wraithbone. They moved with impossible precision, not as lumbering machines, but as dancers of death. Each gesture as graceful as it was deadly, and when they struck, it was as though memory itself struck. An enemy cleaved in two was not simply slain, was made part of a story of loss, avenged to the enemy. They were nightmares. Chaos warriors who had mocked the Eldar for weakness now screamed as they faced not mortals, but the dead themselves. Risen not in corruption, but in wrath, demons recoiled, howling in frustration, for the souls bound in wraithbone were beyond their claws. Some whispered in fear that the constructs were not warriors at all, but tombs that walked, coffins that fought, haunted by voices that would never rest. To kill them was impossible, for even when shattered, their stones could be recovered, their spirits bound anew. Death itself had been denied, and denial had become weapon. But within the craft world unease festered. The living knew that to bind the dead in this way was dangerous. Every soul, pressed into wraithbone, carried with it the weight of memory so strong it risked drowning those nearby. Warriors, who fought alongside them sometimes returned, hollow-eyed whispering words, not their own. Some swore they felt hands upon their shoulders mid-battle, guiding their strikes with force not entirely theirs. Others collapsed afterward, weeping uncontrollably, unable to say whose grief they had carried. The line between the living and the dead blurred, and with it, the very notion of identity. Still, none turned away. The Oath of Exile demanded that vengeance outweigh unease, and the dead themselves refused silence. Many who entered the Infinity Circuit whispered ceaselessly, begging for vessels. They would not rest. They demanded to strike again, to walk once more upon the battlefield and scream their names into the faces of those who had mocked them. The seers struggled to contain them, but in the end, they yielded. Better to let the dead strike in vengeance than to let their cries poison the circuit itself. The rituals grew darker, more desperate. Entire chambers were dedicated to the shaping of wraithbone, walls thrumming with the half-screams of spirits pressing through. Spirit seers walked those halls day and night, binding and guiding, their eyes bleeding from the strain. They whispered constant liturgies, not of peace, but of anger, coaxing the souls into compliance, telling them the war was not over, that their blades were still needed. Every success was a victory, every failure a haunting, and so the battlefield became filled not only with warriors of flesh, but with legions of memory. Towers of wraithbone strode beside aspect warriors, their limbs glowing with psychic energy, their steps vibrating with the weight of thousands of voices within. When they struck, they did so with all the power of grief multiplied, vengeance amplified into fury. Chaos, for all its endless tide, faltered before them. It is one thing to face a soldier. It is another to face one who has already died and returned, who knows no fear because they have nothing left to lose. Rumors spread even among the Eldar themselves. Some whispered that the constructs were no longer merely the souls of the dead, but amalgamations, fusions of grief so vast they no longer belonged to one voice but to many, that each wraithlord was a chorus wearing armor, a choir of the fallen bound together into a single shell. And if this was true, then vengeance had become something larger than any individual. It had become a tide, relentless, unstoppable, echoing across battlefield after battlefield until the very ground seemed to tremble with memory. Thus, wraithbone and memory fused into weapon. Death no longer marked the end of the Oath of Exile. It extended it. Every fallen warrior became potential. Every shattered life, another step in constructs that walked like justice made flesh. The battlefield was no longer only a place of war. It was a cathedral where memory itself preached, every strike a sermon, every scream of a construct a litany of rage. The living and the dead fought as one, and in their unity, vengeance took on a form no demon could corrupt, no enemy could silence. The warp is not content to remain unseen. It yawns open like wounds in the void, tearing apart the skin of reality, spilling corruption into the stars. For most races, such rifts are omens of inevitable ruin, marks upon the galaxy that none can heal. But for the Eldar in exile, the rift is not only a scar to be feared, is a stage upon which vengeance must be played. They do not strike at random, nor do they fight merely to preserve themselves. They fight to deny chaos its claim, to prove that not all things broken are surrendered. Where the rift opens, the Eldar set it ablaze. It begins with the seers, their runes circling in light, visions drawn in skeins of probability. They sense the tremors before the rift tears, feel the pull of gravity shifting, hear the laughter echoing faint through the immaterium. For them, it is never surprise, it is expectation. And with expectation comes preparation. War hosts gather in silence, aspect shrines opening their doors, wraith constructs stirred from uneasy rest, corsair fleets aligning their trajectories. The Harlequins sometimes appear too unbidden, as though scenting the performance yet to unfold. Each knows what is demanded. The enemy is not to be repelled, it is to be erased. When the rift finally blooms, it is not with subtlety. Reality fractures like glass, shards of light bending inward, darkness spewing outward. Demons spill into the galaxy like bile from a rotted wound, screaming praises to powers that are not gods, but hunger's given voice. Entire landscapes convulse, air shattering into storms of fire, oceans boiling away into vapor. It is annihilation by design, desecration without pause. And into this, the Eldar descend. Their weapons burn brighter in such places, as though grief itself rises in defiance of the warp's laughter. Spears of light carve through demon flesh, dissolving them not into return, but into nothingness, unmaking what had clawed itself from unreality. Shuriken fire glitters across the torn horizon like starlight, refusing to dim, each shot a name remembered, each kill a debt repaid. Runes blaze on armor and blade alike, glowing not as decoration, but as wards. Each symbol pressed into the air with psychic defiance. Where chaos seeks permanence, the Eldar write denial, refusing to let the warp hold what it has claimed. The battles fought upon the rifts are not measured in victory or defeat. They are measured in endurance. Every moment the Eldar hold the line, every heartbeat in which chaos does not spread, is triumph enough. They fight not to preserve themselves, but to preserve meaning. A ruined world can be remembered. A profaned shrine can be avenged. But a rift, if left unchecked, consumes memory itself, rewriting the galaxy in madness. That is what they deny. That is what they burn to ash, before it can take root. It is said that when Eldar seers walk into the heart of a rift, their eyes burn with light so fierce it scars even the demons who behold them. They raise their hands, inscribing circles of runes into the torn air, each symbol pressing against the wound of reality. Warriors form rings around them, blades and rifles raised, their chants weaving into the psychic chorus. Wraithlords stride into the storm like monuments of grief, their steps vibrating with the rage of countless souls. Harlequins dart in laughter, carving demons into ribbons, their masks reflecting the madness of the warp back upon itself. The battlefield becomes something more than war, it becomes liturgy, denial made flesh, ritual enacted through fire and blade. One legend tells of a rift that opened above a once sacred planet, its surface already writhing with demon hordes. The Craftworld seers decreed the world unsafe, yet they descended anyway, not to save, but to deny. War hosts poured fire upon the planet until its crust cracked, until magma drowned the profaned temples. Then, with chants that echoed across the immaterium, they sealed the rift with sacrifice, binding the souls of fallen warriors into its edges, stitching it closed with their very existence. Chaos had claimed a world, but the Eldar had claimed a ruin of chaos. Nothing was left but silence. It was not survival. It was not triumph. It was vengeance, made manifest in denial. The enemies of the Eldar cannot comprehend this. For the servants of the dark gods, destruction is victory. For humans, survival is triumph. But for the Eldar, in exile, triumph is measured only in denial. What chaos cannot keep, what chaos cannot desecrate further, what chaos cannot laugh over when the smoke clears. Their oath is not to win, not to rebuild, not to claim. It is to say, no further. Not this place, not today. And in that refusal, they find meaning that even gods cannot unmake. Rumors have spread that the warp itself recoils at these battles, that demons mutter of songs sung in fire, of grief burning so hot it sears the immaterium. Some whisper that rifts have sealed themselves at the approach of Eldar fleets, as though the warp knew what awaited it. True or not, the tales serve their purpose. Chaos now fears denial, and fear is the rarest weapon one can wield against it. When the fighting ends, the fields are not left in silence, but in memory. Craters glow with rune scripts carved by fire. Shattered husks of demons crumble into dust that will not return. Spirit stones carried by the slain are placed upon the sealed rifts, binding grief into monuments so that all who pass will remember. No victory songs are sung, for victory is not their pursuit. Instead, they stand in quiet, gazing upon the fire-scarred horizon, knowing only this: chaos has been denied. That is enough. Thus fire upon the rift becomes another pillar of their vengeance. Blades forged in sorrow, songs of the lost, masks of ruin, ambushes of silence, dreams of war, constructs of memory, all now joined by the fire that denies chaos its hunger. To fight upon the rift is to burn so fiercely that even the immaterium trembles, and in those moments, the oath of exile is kept not in triumph, not in survival, but in refusal, unyielding as wraith, unbreakable as memory. Exile did not bind every Eldar to the sanctity of the Craftworld. Some had long since walked the path of the Corsair, castaways and wanderers who rejected the rigid disciplines of the paths and instead surrendered themselves to freedom in the void. They were raiders, smugglers, pirates, names spoken in distrust even by their own kin. Yet, when chaos spread, even these fractured outcasts felt the call of vengeance. Whatever grudges had separated them from the Craftworlds were swallowed by a greater hunger, to punish, to bleed, to strip the servants of the warp until nothing but bones and ash drifted. Where once their banners had flown, the Corsairs did not fight like the disciplined aspect warriors, nor like the towering constructs of Wraithbone and Memory. They struck like storms, sudden and furious, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. Their fleets were a patchwork of stolen vessels, painted with clashing colors, sails unfurled like banners of defiance. Some bore the sigils of lost houses, others scrawled runes of mockery meant to provoke. When they emerged from the Webway, or slipped unseen into real space, it was never to announce themselves, it was to fall upon their prey, with the inevitability of lightning splitting the night. Chaos ships were their chosen quarry. Corsairs stalked them across trade routes, shadowed them through nebulae, waited with engines cold until the warbands grew complacent. Then they descended, sleek hulls cutting through void black, weapons blazing in silent arcs of destruction. Boarding actions became massacres. Eldar blades flashed in the flickering gloom of corrupted vessels, cutting down heretics and demons alike. Each strike was as much performance as slaughter. Decks left littered with corpses arranged in deliberate patterns. Sigils carved into steel, with plasma fire, runes of vengeance daubed across the walls in blood. The Corsairs did not merely kill, they punished. Every raid was both piracy and retribution. They stripped chaos vessels of weapons, engines, cargo, until nothing but skeletal wrecks remained adrift in the void. They harvested what was needed to sustain their fractured fleet's munitions. Fuel, soulstones scavenged from the forgotten dead end, then left the husks behind as monuments of denial. To any who came upon them later, the message was unmistakable. Here, chaos was mocked, humiliated, torn apart not only in body but in spirit. The void became littered with these silent wrecks, ghost ships drifting aimlessly, grim trophies of Corsair wrath. Among the Corsairs, vengeance took on a different flavor than in the Craftworlds. It was raw, unrestrained, bordering on madness. They reveled in the destruction they wrought, their laughter echoing through blood-slick corridors, their masks painted not with sorrow but with mockery. To them, every raid was a chance to spit in the eye of gods who claimed dominion over suffering. If the Craftworlds bound their grief into song and ritual, the Corsairs unleashed it as fire and steel. Every scream of an enemy a chorus they conducted with blades. Yet for all their wildness, there was unity in their wrath. Pirates who would once have slit each other's throats over treasure now fought side by side, bound by the common target of chaos. Rival captains clasped hands before battle, swearing temporary brotherhood in the name of vengeance. Even those who had turned their backs on the Craftworlds entirely, swearing never again to bow to seers or shrines, found themselves drawn into the oath of exile. For what chaos had taken from one Eldar, it had taken from all. In that shared wound, fractured kin became kin once more. Chaos came to dread the Corsair fleets more than any other foe. Imperial patrols might be predicted, Orc warbands overwhelmed, but Corsairs were storms without warning. They struck at convoys thought secure, raided fleets already bloodied by battle, swept across riftborn warbands before they could gather strength. And always, they left survivors just enough to carry tales. Captains returned, raving of Eldar ships that appeared from nowhere, of decks painted with runes and blood, of laughter echoing even as their vessels burned. To face the Corsairs was not to face soldiers. It was to be hunted by shadows that struck with cruelty so precise it seemed personal. But there was danger in their excess. Some among the seers whispered that the Corsairs skirted too close to indulgence, that their hunger for destruction echoed the very flaws that had birthed She Who Thirsts. Were they truly fighting for vengeance? Or had vengeance become excuse for freedom, for bloodshed, for the joy of the kill? The Corsairs did not answer. They cared little for seer warnings, less for the judgment of Craftworld kin. To them, survival was rebellion, and rebellion was purity enough. The line between punishment and piracy blurred, and some wondered if the Corsairs fought chaos because it was chaos, or simply because it was prey. Yet when the craft worlds faltered, when rifts yawned wider than even seers could seal, it was often Corsair fleets that struck first. They did not wait for ritual or prophecy. They saw fire and leaped into it, trusting in their blades and their speed to carve a path. Many perished in these reckless assaults, their ships burned to cinders, their names lost to void, but those who survived carried stories back, stories that became fuel for the oath of exile. In their ruin, they proved the truth of their creed, that vengeance is not measured in safety, but in scars left upon the enemy. There is a tale told of a Corsair captain who led his ragged fleet into the heart of a warp storm to strike a chaos flagship. His ship burned, his crew torn apart. Yet he boarded the enemy vessel with a handful of warriors, carving his way to the bridge. When at last he fell, he ignited the reactor with his dying strike, taking both ships into oblivion. The wreckage still drifts, fused into a monument of fire and bone. To the Corsairs, his story is not tragedy, it is scripture. Thus the reckoning of the Corsairs becomes another weapon of the exiled Eldar. They are not saints, nor disciplined warriors, nor prophets of the Infinity Circuit. They are outcasts, fractured kin, bound only by hunger for vengeance. Yet in that hunger lies power. Every raid is both piracy and punishment. Every skeletal wreck left adrift, another scar carved into chaos. And though they vanish as suddenly as they arrive, the void remembers their storms. The oath of exile flows through them too, not in silence, not in sorrow, but in the wild laughter of vengeance unleashed without restraint, echoing across the endless dark. The Eldar have always lived with the shadow of endings. Every breath they take is tempered by the knowledge that their empire lies in ruin. Their gods devoured, their souls hunted eternally by the great enemy, and yet, amidst this endless awareness of mortality, rumors began to spread, rumors of fire, of rebirth, of something that refused to die. Whispers spoke of a ritual so dangerous, so profound, that even the seers themselves would not record it in runes. They called it the ritual of the Phoenix. The stories varied. Some said it began with a single warrior, slain in battle, his body broken by the claws of demons. Yet, as his comrades sang their mourning songs, his corpse ignited not in warp flame, but in psychic fire that shimmered like the auroras of long-dead skies. From the ashes, he rose again, armor glowing, eyes burning with light that was not his own. He fought on, his every strike more terrible than before, until at last the demons lay scattered, and he fell a second time, his body collapsing into ash that no hand could touch. Others whispered that entire war hosts had vanished into flame, only to reappear days later, reborn from their own ruin. No tale agreed on detail, yet all spoke of fire, of return, of vengeance that refused to end. The seers dismissed these stories as myth, yet even they could not silence the murmurs. There are too many accounts, too many witnesses, swearing that they had seen comrades fall and rise again in fire. The Harlequins, when asked, only laughed, masks gleaming with secrets. Rebirth is theater, they said, and theater is truth, if you play it well enough. To the Harlequins, myth and performance are indistinguishable. Perhaps that was the answer all along. The ritual of the Phoenix was not fact or fiction, but both. A play enacted upon the battlefield until it became real among the survivors. The idea took root with terrible power. To believe that death was not final, that vengeance could carry one back even from the brink, was intoxicating. Warriors carved phoenix runes into their armor, painted flames upon their helms, whispered the liturgies before battle. Spirit seers began to experiment with rites of fire, weaving psychic resonance into their chants, calling upon the infinity circuit to burn brighter, to bind more fiercely. Some succeeded. Others perished, screaming, their bodies consumed by uncontrolled flame, their souls vanishing into silence. Still, the experiments continued, for hope is stronger than fear. The ritual itself, as pieced together from fragments of testimony, was not a spell or incantation in the simple sense. It was sacrifice. Warriors would offer themselves wholly to the memory of the dead, surrendering their own soul stone's integrity to the infinity circuit. If the ritual took, they would burn consumed in psychic fire so intense it seared even the air. If they returned, they were no longer quite themselves. Their voices echoed with the chorus of many souls. Their movements fluid but uncanny, their eyes reflecting flames that never dimmed. To fight beside such a one was to fight beside both comrade and revenant, blessing and curse united in a single body. On the battlefield, these phoenix-born were terror given form. Demons recoiled before them, sensing fire that burned not with warp corruption, but with something purer, something that denied them utterly. Their blades struck with precision beyond mortal reflex, as if guided by unseen hands. Their presence turned despair into frenzy, their very existence proof that the oath of exile was eternal, unbreakable. Chaos whispered of them as abominations, souls who should have been devoured but instead returned, flames that mocked the dark god's hunger. Yet to the Eldar, they were miracles costly, perilous miracles, but miracles nonetheless. Still, unease grew. To return from death is not natural. Not even for a people as steeped in psychic power as the Eldar. The Phoenix-born carried with them the scent of ash. The aura of endings stretched thin. Some spoke of their laughter echoing too long, their words slipping into tones not quite their own. Were they truly the warriors who had fallen, or amalgamations, many voices woven into one? No seer dared give answer. The Harlequins, when pressed, only bowed mockingly and whispered. The dead loved the stage too much to leave it empty. One tale tells of a phoenix-born who rose 3 times in a single battle, each time burning brighter, each time striking with greater ferocity. When the battle ended, his comrades turned to him with awe, only to find his armor empty, his soulstone cracked into dust. They carried the fragments to the infinity circuit, and there the runes glowed faintly, as if still warm. The seers declared it a warning. The warriors declared it victory. Both were right, whether blessing, curse, or myth. The ritual of the phoenix became another weapon in the arsenal of vengeance. It was not relied upon, for it was too dangerous, too unpredictable. But it was whispered of, in hushed tones, before desperate battles. Invoked in songs when warriors marched to near certain death. The very possibility that the fallen might rise again was enough to unnerve chaos, enough to embolden kin. Hope, even mythic hope, became a blade as sharp as sorrow. In the end, the truth matters little. Perhaps the Phoenix-born were no more than stories exaggerated in grief. Illusions spun by Harlequins, or rare psychic accidents mistaken for miracles. Or perhaps they were real souls bound by vengeance so fiercely that even death could not contain them. For the Eldar, truth and myth often intertwine, each feeding the other until they are indistinguishable. What is certain is this: the ritual of the phoenix became part of the oath of exile. A fire whispered in song, a rune painted in flame, a promise that vengeance would not die, even when flesh and bone had turned to ash. Thus the exiled carried fire within them, uncertain whether it was curse or salvation, but certain that chaos would one day feel its heat. For vengeance does not end with death, in grief made flame, in ashes given form, in whispers of rebirth. The Eldar found yet another way to say the words they had sworn since the fall of their world. Never forget. Never forgive. The paths of the Aspect Warriors had always been a discipline of focus, a way for the Eldar to channel the overwhelming intensity of their souls into forms of craft and battle. Yet, in exile, after the burning of their world and the endless oath of vengeance that followed, these paths changed. No longer were they only disciplines of war, they became embodiments of grief itself. Each mask, each ritual, each gesture became a reflection of loss, sharpened into weaponry. To Dan, the helm of an Aspect Warrior was no longer to adopt a craft of war. It was to surrender identity to vengeance. The shrines of the Aspects were fuller now than they had been in generations. Survivors who could not contain their sorrow in silence, who could not bind it in song or hammer it into blades, turned instead to the shrines. There, they shed their names and donned masks painted not with colors of tradition, but with the shapes of their mourning. Every dire avenger inscribed runes upon their crests that whispered the names of the fallen. Every howling banshee painted her face, not only with the white of death, but with streaks of ash, as though to carry the smoke of their ruined world into battle. The striking scorpions darkened their helms until they seemed more shadow than flesh. Every strike an echo of grief's hidden edge. The howling banshees embodied the scream of loss. Their wails no longer only weapons, but the echoes of grief that refused to fade. To hear them upon the battlefield was to hear the cries of children lost, of lovers slain, of shrines profaned. Chaos warriors who once mocked their shrieks now broke at the sound, their minds unraveling before the purity of grief amplified into sonic death. Among their own kind, some whispered that the banshees no longer screamed, only to kill, that their cries carried fragments of the infinity circuit itself. Voices of the dead riding upon their keening. If so, then every battle cry was chorus, the living and dead shrieking as one. The dire avengers were the oath made flesh, the vow incarnate. They trained until their strikes carried not only precision, but inevitability, each shot loosed, as though guided by memory itself. Their exarchs led them with eyes hard as wraithbone, teaching that every enemy slain was another debt balanced, another name honored. They stood in formation, not as soldiers, but as mourners, blades flashing in silence, until the moment of strike, when the air split with fire and steel. To face them was to face inevitability. The line would not break, the volley would not falter, the oath would not bend. The striking scorpions were shadows of grief, patience sharpened into cruelty. They stalked the ruins of chaos-held worlds, with mandiblades clicking in rhythm, their helms painted black with runes of ash. They waited in silence, sometimes for days, until the moment of vengeance was perfect. When they struck, it was not merely death, but ritual slaughter. Every cut a memory Their enemies rarely saw them coming. They only felt the sudden burst of agony, the last sight of masks gleaming from shadow, and the knowledge that grief had hunted them to their end. The fire dragons carried the fire of denial, their fusion weapons burning with the intensity of worlds lost to warp flame. Each shot was more than destruction. It was reenactment, vengeance made visible in torrents of heat that reduced even the strongest demon engines to molten wreckage. Survivors said the fire dragons did not merely fire upon their enemies. They relived the burning of their own world with every squeeze of the trigger, turning devastation into justice. To see them stride through flame was to watch grief itself refuse to die. Wielded as torch and blade alike, even the shining spears, long known for their precision strikes and blinding swiftness, became avatars of memory. Their lances gleamed, not only with psychic light, but with runes carved to commemorate the fallen. They rode like storms across the battlefield, their charges less battle tactic than ritual. To see their line break through the enemy was to witness inevitability in motion. A surge of grief so focused it became unstoppable momentum. And then there were the exiles, those who had walked the path so deeply they could never leave it. In exile, they became something more terrible still. Their masks no longer represented a role assumed, but identities consumed by grief so fully that nothing remained beneath. They were not individuals, but symbols, living monuments of vengeance. Warriors who fought under them whispered that the exarch's voices no longer sounded like one, but like many layers of grief stacked upon grief, all speaking through the same mask. Whether this was truth or perception mattered little. To follow them was to march into battle, knowing you carried not only your sorrow, but the sorrow of all who had walked that path before you. The seers warned of the danger in this, for the path was meant to contain the soul, to channel its intensity into discipline. Yet the exiled knew there was no returning to discipline as it once was. The masks had become more than tools, they had become vessels. To paint one's face, to don one's helm, was to surrender to vengeance entirely, to let it inhabit your body until you became its extension. The warriors did not resist. They embraced it. Better to be consumed by vengeance than by despair. Chaos came to fear these masks above all. To face an Eldar warrior was one thing. To face a faceless reflection of grief was another. Demons shrieked that they could not read the faces of aspect warriors, could not see weakness or fear. Mortals fled before their visages, their courage breaking under the realization that the enemy they fought was not a person but a role, a concept, a mask that would never die. For even if the warrior beneath fell, another would don the mask, and grief would live on, sharpened anew. The oath of exile was etched into these faces, painted in ash, carved in rune, burned into wraithbone helms. Every aspect became a mask, not of tradition, but of loss, given form. The howling banshee's scream was no longer simply psychic. Shokit was the wail of a people, refusing silence. The dire avenger's precision was not mere training, it was the oath spoken with every shot. The striking scorpion's shadow was not stealthy, was grief crouched and waiting. Each mask told the same truth in different language. Vengeance is identity, and identity is vengeance. Thus, in exile, the aspect shrines became cathedrals of memory. Warriors entered them not only to train, but to become something greater than themselves. To paint the face was to cease being one and to join the many, to wear not only armor, but history. They no longer asked who they were. They asked only which mask they would wear, which grief they would embody, which oath they would carry into the void. And when they marched, they did so faceless, voiceless. Endless, an army of vengeance painted in war. The vengeance of the Eldar was never simple, never contained to the enemies that seemed obvious. Though chaos remained, the great wound, the eternal thief of worlds and souls. The Eldar did not forget that humanity whom they scornfully named Man Ki walked paths of arrogance and blindness that often brought ruin in their wake. To the Imperium, the galaxy is theirs by divine right, every world to be claimed, every alien a trespasser. To the Eldar, this arrogance is only another form of desecration, another insult layered upon the greater crime of the fall. And so vengeance began to blur. The oath sworn in exile against chaos stretched its shadow outward, until even the Monkey felt its edge. At first it was only rumor. Imperial armies spoke in whispers of battles that shifted without explanation. A chaos ambush that should have annihilated a regiment instead collapsed inexplicably. Enemy champions struck down by unseen hands. A fleet on the brink of defeat found their foes already shattered. Wreckage drifting across void black with no sign of who had delivered the blow. In other cases, the rumors carried darker weight. Entire companies marched into battle, only to vanish. Their corpses found days later, with rune scars burned into their armor. Their blood painted into patterns no human could decipher. Survivors swore they had glimpsed shadows in the smoke, figures too graceful to be orcs, too precise to be demons, masks gleaming for only an instant before vanishing. The Imperium, bound by doctrine, could not acknowledge such things. To speak openly of alien intervention was heresy, a fracture against the Emperor's divine dominion. But soldiers are not priests, and soldiers remember. Around firelight on barren worlds, hushed voices told stories of ghosts, sometimes saviors, sometimes executioners, always silent, always unknowable. The truth, as the Eldar understood it, was simple. Humanity's fate was not theirs to protect, but neither was it theirs to ignore. The galaxy is a web of threads, and if a single strand is allowed to rot, the entire design unravels. A regiment lost here, a world consumed their reach, had consequences far beyond the understanding of mortal humans. The seers saw these strands clearly, each future balanced upon fragile intersections. To act was not kindness, it was necessity, and vengeance, when shaped so precisely, often meant striking the Monkey themselves. For their ignorance and arrogance had too often played into the hands of chaos. There were moments when the Eldar intervened as saviors. Silent strikes tore apart demon packs before they could overwhelm human defenses. Precision raids dismantled chaos sorcerers whose rituals would have consumed entire cities. On such days, Imperial soldiers fought with renewed courage, never knowing that unseen kin were watching, guiding their hands with invisible threads. They believed victory, their own, their chaplains crying praise to the Emperor, never realizing their lives had been spared, not by faith, but by grief-stricken kin who refused to let chaos have another feast. But there were darker moments too, when Imperial commanders blundered into sacred ruins. When their tanks rolled across sites the Eldar had sworn to memory, the ghosts became executioners. Entire regiments were swallowed in silence, their vox signals cut, their bodies arranged in patterns that meant nothing to human eyes, but everything to Eldar memory. To the Monkey, it seemed arbitrary slaughter, betrayal without cause. To the Eldar, it was balance. The Imperium's arrogance was a wound that could not be permitted to fester. Every trespass was answered in kind, every insult remembered. The Harlequins relished such interventions most of all. They wove performances upon battlefields where Monkey and Chaos alike became unwilling actors. Their deaths choreographed into plays of vengeance. Soldiers spoke afterward of laughter echoing across the smoke, of masks gleaming in the dark, of blades cutting down friend and foe alike with equal indifference. The Harlequins never distinguished between saving and punishing. To them all was theater, and the Monkey was simply another audience that could neither understand nor refuse. Imperial commanders began to whisper of Eldar treachery. Inquisitors gathered reports of unexplained battles, debating whether these were myths, Xenos infiltration, or the Emperor's own angels in disguise. Some declared the Eldar heretics to be exterminated without mercy, while others argued that these ghosts had preserved Imperial victories too often to be dismissed. The truth mattered little. The Imperium cannot understand ambiguity, and the Eldar thrive within it. For the exiled, the Monkey were neither allies nor enemies. They were instruments. Humanity was too blind to understand the skeins of fate, too clumsy to hold the galaxy together without constant blunders. The Eldar did not strike for their sake, nor did they kill out of malice. They acted only when memory demanded it, when vengeance whispered through the infinity circuit that a debt must be paid, whether in demon blood or in human screams. To the Eldar, it made no difference. Vengeance does not discriminate, yet unease stirred even among the kin. Some asked whether striking the Monkey risked becoming distraction, diluting the purity of the oath against chaos. Others insisted that humanity was part of the same wound that their arrogance, their desecrations, their endless wars had enabled chaos at every turn. To punish them was not indulgence, but justice. The debate never ended, and perhaps it never could. The truth lay in the silence of the battlefield, where human soldiers stared into smoke and swore. They saw shadows that were not theirs. There is a story of a battle fought upon a world consumed by plague, Imperial guardsmen, choking on rot, prepared for their final stand against the demonic tide. Then, without warning, fire rained upon the enemy lines, runes blazing in the night sky. The demons dissolved into ash, their warlords split apart by a single shining spear. The humans wept with relief, crying the Emperor's name, never knowing that the shadows who saved them also left their commander's corpse arranged in the dust. Runes carved into his flesh to remind all who looked that the ghosts do not save without cost. Thus, among the Monkey, the Eldar became myth. Some prayed to them as hidden angels. Others cursed them as tricksters. None understood them. That was as it should be. For the oath of exile was never for humanity's sake. It was for memory, for vengeance, for balance. The Eldar did not act to be understood. They acted because grief demanded it, and because the galaxy itself was too fragile to entrust to the blind hands of men. So the ghosts moved among the Monkey, unseen, unacknowledged, unnamed, sometimes saviors, sometimes executioners, always servants of grief, bound by the oath that nothing would go unanswered, no insult would go unpaid. The Imperium may claim ignorance, the Inquisition may call it heresy, the chaplains may ascribe it to the Emperor's will, but the truth lies elsewhere, in shadows. The dead remember, and through their kin, they strike. The seers spoke in whispers during this time, their voices thin as wind sliding through broken crystal. For in their visions they no longer saw the skein of fate as flowing strands, clear and luminous, but as mirrors shattering one upon another, fragments scattered in every direction, sharp and gleaming, each shard reflecting a future both possible and impossible. They called this vision the prophecy of glass, and with it came fear, for in every shard there was vengeance. But whether fulfilled or denied was never certain. The path of the seer had always been burdened by ambiguity. The future for the Eldar is never a straight road, but a maze filled with dead ends, illusions, and doors that open only once. Yet the prophecy of glass was different. It showed not one thread leading to another, but splinters. Hundreds, thousands of images flickering all at once. In one shard, the Craftworld burned, its oath of exile silenced forever. In another, chaos screamed as Eldar vengeance cut them apart until nothing remained. In another still, the galaxy itself fractured, consumed by fire, with no victor at all. Each shard glimmered as if true, yet none could be held without bleeding. The seers brought these visions to their kin, speaking of futures refracted, endless possibilities that shimmered like knives before them. Some believed the prophecy a gift, proof that vengeance was inevitable, if only the correct shard could be chosen. They spoke eagerly of paths where every debt was paid, every insult avenged, every enemy scattered. They claimed that these visions were not mere possibilities but inevitabilities, waiting to be embraced. To them, the prophecy of glass was hope itself, proof that their grief would one day find resolution. But others argued differently. They said the prophecy was not truth, but desire made visible grief so powerful it bent the immaterium into reflections of what the mourners longed to see. To gaze into the shards was to look not at destiny, but at the hunger of the soul. A seer who had lost his entire shrine saw only futures where his enemy was obliterated. A mother who had lost her children saw only vengeance enacted upon demons with fire and blade. Was this prophecy? Or was it simply the heart clawing so fiercely at meaning that even the warp gave it form? The argument never resolved, for the prophecy of glass was both at once possibility and projection, truth and illusion, indistinguishable to all who sought answers. The Harlequin, as always, played their part. They performed dances with mirrors, shattering them upon the stage, scattering shards across the floor. In each piece of glass, faces seemed to flicker, some of joy, some of grief, some of vengeance, some of despair. At the end of the play, the troupe gathered the shards and rebuilt them into a single broken image, a cracked reflection of the audience themselves. "This is prophecy," the Harlequins said with mocking laughter. "Do you see the future, or only yourselves?" Their words offered no clarity, only riddles, yet they haunted all who witnessed them. Among the warriors, the prophecy of glass became both weapon and curse. Some carried shards of crystal etched with runes into battle, believing that by gazing into them they could glimpse the strike to come, the wound already delivered. Others refused to look at all, fearing that to see one's death was to make it inevitable. Seers argued endlessly over whether showing a shard to a warrior gave them strength or bound them to ruin. Still, the visions continued, fracturing futures into endless patterns that no hand could gather whole. There is a story told of a seer who carried a crystal mirror into battle, gazing into it even as the enemy advanced. She saw herself die a dozen deaths, struck down again and again. Yet she also saw herself triumphant, blade buried in the heart of a demon prince. When the moment came, she cast aside the mirror and chose blind faith instead. She fought with fury, her runes blazing, until she struck exactly as one shard had shown. But in the same instant, the demon slew her. Both shards had been true. Both futures realized. The prophecy of glass had not lied, it had only refused to choose. And so the people debated. Was vengeance fated? Could it be denied? Was it already written in shards scattered across eternity? Or was it only the reflection of their own desire to see vengeance enacted no matter the cost? Some began to fear the prophecy itself, whispering that to gaze into the glass was to fracture one's soul, splitting identity into endless possibilities that could never again be made whole. A few seers disappeared entirely, lost two visions they could not escape, their minds shattered as cleanly as the mirrors they had sought to read. Yet the oath of exile adapted even this. If vengeance lay in shards, then so be it. They would walk each fragment as if it were the only truth, fight each battle as though it were the chosen reflection. The prophecy of glass did not need to be believed to be used. It became another pillar of their war, another language of grief given form. Whether the visions were destiny or desire mattered little. What mattered was that they gave the exiled direction, a sense that, even if the future fractured endlessly, each fracture still led to the same vow: never forgive, never forget. In time, the prophecy of glass spread even among their enemies. Chaos sorcerers whispered of Eldar, who fought as though they had seen the ending already. Warriors who moved with uncanny precision, who laughed in the faces of death because they had already seen it 1,000 times. Imperial commanders cursed them as manipulators, claiming that their prophecies were lies spread to destabilize armies. Yet both foe and ally feared the same thing, that the Eldar had glimpsed something no one else could. That vengeance was not possibility, but inevitability, shattering through every future until nothing could escape it. Thus the prophecy of glass endured, neither wholly true nor wholly false, but as fractured as the people who carried it. Shards of mirror lay scattered across the galaxy, some literal, some metaphorical, each one a reminder that the future is never whole. To gaze into it is to see vengeance fulfilled and vengeance denied, to bleed and to triumph in the same instant. The glass cuts no matter how it is held, and the blood that falls from its edge is always the same: grief, sharpened into blade. The Webway has always been the great artery of the Eldar, a labyrinthine network older than the rise of humanity, older even than the decay that birthed She Who Thirsts. Once it was their highway of empire, a vast and glittering passage through which fleets and armies moved without fear of the warp. Now, in exile, it is something darker. For the exiled Eldar have turned their last inheritance into a killing ground, a place where vengeance coils in silence, waiting for intruders who never leave again. The labyrinth itself has become memory, sharpened into blade. Chaos, warbands, arrogant in their hunger, often sought the hidden doors of the Webway. To them it was a shortcut, a chance to spill out upon unsuspecting worlds before imperial defenses could rise. They expected resistance, yes, but not what awaited them. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air itself turned hostile. Light bent at impossible angles, runes flared on walls that had not been carved by any hand, and silence pressed down like a hand around the throat. For the Eldar had reshaped these passages, not with stone or wraithbone alone, but with grief given form. At first the intruders would laugh, their demons shrieking at the glowing symbols, their champions declaring the paths harmless illusions. But as they advanced, the laughter always fell quiet. Flames burned in the air itself, psychic fires that clung to flesh and spirit alike, igniting not only armor, but memory. Warriors staggered as visions overwhelmed them, the faces of those they had slain, the ruins they had desecrated, the cries of children and lovers reduced to ash. Some tore at their own armor, screaming to be free of the images. Others collapsed, silent, their minds shattered long before their bodies were touched. Those who pressed further met, not armies, but silence. Rangers and striking scorpions waited in shadow, their blades and rifles striking from places unseen, their masks flickering like fragments of nightmare. Each kill was deliberate, each corpse left as a marker, arranged like signposts in a story of annihilation. By the time the warband realized it was being hunted, the maze had already closed. Doors that had opened freely slammed shut, runes shifted, corridors bent back upon themselves. The Webway did not guide them, swallowed them. Survivors, who stumbled back into real space view, though they spoke of corridors that changed with every breath, of companions who vanished between one step and the next, of laughter echoing without source. Some swore that the Webway itself was alive, that the spirits of the dead guided its twists, turning it into a trap no demon could escape. Whether truth or terror, the story spread, and chaos warbands began to hesitate before breaching those hidden doors. The Webway had always been labyrinth, now it was executioner. The spirit seers whispered that the infinity circuit itself had bled into the passages, that grief had imprinted upon the walls until memory and labyrinth became indistinguishable. Every soul that had fallen in exile, every song sung for vengeance, every mask painted with ashage, had left its mark. The corridors remembered. They carried sorrow like veins carry blood, and when chaos entered, that sorrow erupted into violence. What had once been safe passage for a people, now became a labyrinth weaponized. Its very existence, a testament that the dead had not forgotten. Harlequins, too, made the Webway their stage. They danced upon shifting bridges and glowing tunnels, their laughter echoing across infinite corridors. To intruders, their performances were unbearable, every mask a reminder of failure, every leap a reminder that the labyrinth itself mocked them. To allies, their presence was reassurance, proof that the traps were not chance but theater, each step of the foe woven into a mask already written. When the play ended, there were no survivors, only blood spattered across walls that gleamed faintly with light. Even the Monkey spoke of it, though they could never name it truly. Imperial scouts who pursued raiders into the labyrinth rarely returned. Those who did spoke of endless passages, of shadows that moved like predators, of corpses left in patterns too precise to be accident. The Inquisition declared such accounts heresy, dismissing them as hallucinations of the warp. But soldiers who had seen those tunnels never doubted. They called it the Red Maze, the corridors of blood. They feared it more than demons, for demons at least could be killed. The Webway could not dot to the Eldar. It was not cruelty, but necessity. The Oath of Exile demanded that chaos be denied, no matter the method. If the Webway was their last inheritance, then it would not remain only sanctuary, it would be turned into trap, labyrinth, execution ground. Each warband destroyed within its corridors was not only one less enemy, but one more debt paid, one more whisper of vengeance made real. The blood that stained the floors was not simply evidence of battle. It was liturgy, proof that grief had found its form in the stones themselves. Yet unease lingered. Some seers warned that to bind memory too tightly into the webway was to risk corruption, that sorrow woven into stone could twist into obsession. Already, there were signs, corridors that sealed even against allies, doors that refused to open when commanded, runes that glowed with fire even when no enemy was present. Was the labyrinth truly controlled, or had it grown will of its own, shaped by grief until it answered only to memory, not to command? The question remained unanswered, for no one dared to test it. The labyrinth was too useful, too powerful, too vital to deny, and so the oath deepened. The exiled carried their grief not only in song, blade, or mask, but in corridors themselves, in paths that turned into tombs, in mazes lit by flame that consumed body and spirit alike. To wander those passages unbidden was to step into memory sharpened until it cut through flesh. To emerge alive was rare. To emerge unchanged was impossible. The webway had always been their artery. Now it was also their vengeance. Hidden passages became killing fields, mazes became pyres. Silence became the last sound heard by intruders before their blood joined the walls. Some whispered that the labyrinth was no longer simply passage, but something far greater, weaponized memory, a living monument of sorrow that could never be broken. And in this, perhaps, they were right, for the Eldar had remade even their inheritance into blade, and in its endless halls, vengeance flowed forever. The oath that began in ashes did not end in fire. It stretched on, woven through song, mask, ambush, dream, and shard. Each thread pulled tight by grief until it became indistinguishable from identity. The Eldar in exile did not rebuild their empire, nor did they heal the wound chaos had carved into them. They learned instead to endure it, to make of their grief a weapon so sharp that even gods bled when touched. The galaxy did not notice at first. To the Imperium, they remained ghosts, flickers of alien cruelty, or salvation that left no explanation. To chaos, they became an irritation, a whisper of inevitability that could not be crushed, no matter how many worlds were burned. To themselves, they became something else entirely, people who no longer measured victory in survival or empire, but in the refusal to vanish. Every strike, every raid, every scream upon the battlefield was not simply war. It was liturgy. It was oath. It was the fire of memory carried forward through generations that refused to let silence claim the dead. The blades forged in sorrow did not dull. The songs of the lost did not fade. The masks of ruin, the ambushes in shadow, the dreams of war, the constructs of memory all became facets of the same truth, that vengeance was eternal, and vengeance was their life. And yet, the stories never agreed on where it all leads. Some whisper that the oath of exile is only another shard in the prophecy of glass, a mirror destined to break at last, scattering even vengeance into nothing. Others believe it is endless, that so long as chaos endures, the Eldar will endure too. Bound to their enemies by hatred so complete, it has become the language of their survival. Still others claim the dead themselves march toward some final act, a chorus gathering beyond the veil, waiting for the moment when grief itself will become a god. The truth remains unwritten, as fragile as glass, as sharp as the blades they wield. What can be said with certainty is this: wherever chaos spreads, wherever desecration claims another world, the oath stirs anew. Ghosts walk among mortals. Masks descend in silence. Songs echo through fire. And vengeance never sated, never finished waits like a blade in the dark. Carried on the wind of exile, whispered from the lips of the dead into the hands of the living. The curtain does not close. The play is not finished. For the Eldar, vengeance is not a chapter in their story. It is their story, and it will be told for as long as grief endures in the galaxy forever, until the last star burns to ash, and silence itself is forced to listen.